Okay, good evening. If we could give my mom another round of applause. Without her, there really are no words. That's okay. Welcome to the 13th Annual Prechter Lecture. Thank you for coming. The spirit of the Prechter program and the ongoing work is rooted in my dad's life and his legacy. He is someone who viewed the world in a different light with tremendous compassion and a thirst for adventure. I was thinking about one of my favorite memories with my dad. We were down in Texas, one of my dad's peace places. One night he took us off-roading. It was a yellow prototype Jeep with gray detail. After veering off what one may call a path, I recall getting stuck in the ditch, and the car was literally almost vertical. We had no choice but to walk home by moonlight. It was unexpected, and it was a magical night. And my dad jokingly said, "I forgot my cowboy hat in the car." And we said, "You also forgot the car." We laughed the whole way back while singing, "She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes." And we made up our own lyrics to reflect how my mom would feel when we got back. This really brief peek into our lives played out years before bipolar, suicide, brain health, any of that was a part of our everyday. When thinking about this research, the Prechter program, the work that has been done, and the road that we have yet to take, I'm reminded about the path less traveled. It involves collaboration, innovation, and passion to not only better understand this term bipolar, but more importantly, the people, including me, who have to live with it, to help manage it, to help individuals and to help their families to find ways to live a fulfilled life and an empowered life. That's a legacy of which we are all a part. Now, without further ado, it is my honor to introduce to you our featured speaker, a devoted father and advocate, Pete Earley. Pete Earley is a storyteller who has penned 17 books, including 4 New York Times bestsellers. After a 14-year career in journalism, including 6 years at the Washington Post, Pete became a full-time author. Pete's book, Crazy, a finalist for the 2007 Pulitzer Prize, described his son's mental breakdown and arrest, which prompted Pete to become an advocate for strong mental health reform. His advocacy has taken him to 49 states and multiple countries around the globe. Please join me in welcoming Pete Earley to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled. Is that sound level okay? Because I have a loud voice. I'm so thrilled to be here tonight. And I want to thank Stephanie. I got to tell you, when my son was at his worst and I'd see someone like you, it gave me hope. So thank you for being a peer and someone who others can look up to and gain from. And thanks to your mother for generous, and so many of you for making what you have here at the University of Michigan really, really unique. I have been all across the country, as Stephanie said. I've never seen one center like this devoted to helping the 5.7 million people who have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So I am the parent of an adult son with a mental. What does that mean? What does it feel like? If I can tell you, I was there when my son was born, and when he was psychotic, I was looking at a stranger, a person who I couldn't recognize, who was completely alien to me. What does it mean to be the parent of an adult son with a mental? It means I am the subject of whispers. Oh, all you had to do is look at the parent to understand what's wrong with that kid. Or as one mental health professional told me before he found out that I had a son with mental illness, oh, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. What does it mean to be the parent of an adult son? It means I have called the police on my son. I have seen my son tasered. I have followed him to the police station, seen him laying on his belly with his hands chained behind, connected to his feet, and officers making fun of him as he talked about how he was sent by God to save Natalie Portman. What does it mean? It means having his brothers and sisters accuse me of coddling my son, of spending too much time with him. Having family members, relatives saying, oh, just let him hit rock bottom. What does it mean to be the parent of an adult son with mental illness? It means that I've had people who don't believe in psychiatry tell me I am torturing my son, that it's simply a social construct. And having my son find every website he can possibly find that justifies that, saying, see, there is no such thing as mental illness. What does it mean? It means I have stood before a judge who doesn't know my son and two attorneys who immediately met him 5 minutes earlier, and they're fighting me to keep him from being hospitalized and having them succeed, and leaving my son standing there furious at me while they walk out the door. What does it mean to be the parent of an adult son with a mental illness? It means I have spent hours and hours trying to convince my son that he is ill. And then I've had an insurance company come after I've convinced him that medications, and in his case, they help him. I've had that insurance company come and say, we're not going to pay for that. We don't believe that medicine is useful. And I've had a psychiatrist say to him, oh, okay, you can take that medication, but you have to understand that it's a placebo. It really doesn't work. What does it mean? It means I know what it's like to hold my adult son in my arms while he sobs and tells me he just wants to be normal when everyone else is telling him he is not normal. He can't rent an apartment. He can't work. He doesn't deserve friends. I know these feelings, every one of them, because I have felt them. The first sign that was something wrong with, in the book, I call him Michael because it's his middle name, but his real first name is Kevin. The first sign that I knew something was wrong was while he was at the Pratt Institute, an art school in New York, and I live outside Washington, D.C., and we talked every Sunday. And on this particular call, he said to me, Dad, food doesn't taste good. And I said, okay, well, no, I don't want to talk about it. Hang up. 5 minutes later, Dad, I think I took 5 homeless people to breakfast. Really? But I don't want to talk about it. Hang up. Finally, 5 minutes later, a call. Dad, I don't know whether I'm dreaming or I'm awake. I said, hang on, son. I'm coming to New York. Well, I raced up to New York, and meanwhile, my wife, Patty, found us a psychiatrist, which was pretty a miracle on that short notice. And I took my son. He wanted to know. It's important to realize he wanted to know what was wrong. And I took him to see the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist talked to us, and then he said to me, Mr. Earley, if you're lucky, your son is using drugs. If not, he has a mental illness. Lucky if my son is using drugs? Well, a blood test showed he wasn't using drugs. So then the doctor said, Mr. Earley, I'm not one of these psychiatrists who's going to sugarcoat things. Your son has bipolar disorder. It is incurable. He probably will never be able to work. He probably will never be able to get married. It's not wise for him to ever have a family. And by the way, there's a good chance he will have an encounter with the police. He could end up homeless. And people with mental illness, by the way, die as much as 25 years before everyone else. Can you imagine how I felt leaving that office? And I looked at Kevin. He looked at me and said, you know, Dad, that guy's crazy. You know, my wife, Patty, was recently diagnosed with kidney cancer. What did we do? We went out, we read all the studies, and we said, we can beat this. We're going to do this. Kevin did the same thing. He wasn't going to be one of those homeless, psychotic people on the streets. Well, the doctor gave him medication, and he took it for 2-3 weeks, and then he stopped taking it. And I was so ignorant. I thought, well, you have a headache, you take aspirin. Why would you keep taking the medicine? Flash forward. A year later, I get a call from his brother, Steve, who says, come to New York, Dad. Kevin is crazy. Well, I raced to New York, and my son had been wandering around Manhattan 5 days. He hadn't slept. He was convinced God had him on a special mission. And I got him in the car, and during that frantic car ride, I would say to him, please, please, take your medicine, take those pills. Pills are poison. Leave me alone. And then as we pulled into an emergency room, because I didn't have a family psychiatrist, he said, Dad, how would you feel if someone you loved killed himself? Well, we came in and the nurse rolled her eyes while Kevin talked nonsense about how God had him on this mission. And then we were taken to completely segregated from everyone else in a room. And we sat there and we sat there and we sat there. And after 4 hours, my son said, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm going to leave. I said, hang on, Kevin, hang on. And I literally went out and I grabbed a doctor. And I will never forget how that doctor came into the room. He came in with his hands up as if he was surrendering. He said, I'm sorry, Mr. Earley, we're really busy and I really can't help your son. I said, you haven't even examined him. And he explained that it didn't matter. The nurse had told him that my son thought all pills were poison. And unless my son posed an imminent danger to himself or others, there was no way anyone could force him into treatment, force him to take medication. And the fact we'd been sitting there for 4 hours was clue that there was no imminent danger. So he said to me, as my son was running out the door, you seem like a concerned father. Bring him back after he tries to hurt you or someone else. Well, I took my son home, and I watched the next 48 hours him getting sicker and sicker. He had tinfoil wrapped around his head to keep the CIA from reading his thoughts through the TV. He slipped out of the house. He slipped out. He broke into a stranger's house. He broke in to take a bubble bath. Luckily, no one was there. It took 5 police officers to get him out. When they did, they raced him over to a mental health treatment center, and they called me, and I went racing over there. A policeman was standing outside, very kind man, and he said, Mr. Earley, let me give you some advice, not as a police officer, but as a father to a father. Even though your son's told us he has bipolar disorder, even though he's told us he's lost his medication, even though we picked him up in a house where he's taking a bubble bath, unless you go tell that doctor that he has threatened to kill or hurt you, he will not be taken to a hospital. We will take him to jail, and you don't want that. So I looked at him and I said, my son hasn't threatened to kill me. And he shrugged and walked away. So I'm here tonight to tell you, and I do it with no pride because it hurt my relationship with my son. I went in and I lied. I said, hey, my son's threatened to kill me. And that was good enough to get him held over 24 hours, at which point he voluntarily checked himself into a hospital. But our problems were far from over. 24 hours after my son was admitted in that hospital, I got a call from his doctor. Mr. Earley, we're going to have to discharge your son. Your insurance company says they're not going to pay for this, and he doesn't belong here. Well, I decided to call that insurance company. And I happened to mention in that call that I used to work at the Washington Post. And I happened to mention that Mike Wallace was a good personal friend of mine, and they should expect a call. Now, can you imagine what happened when Mike Wallace did call? Because he did. This Mike Wallace was 60 Minutes. How come Pete Earley's son is being discharged? All of a sudden, my son was allowed to stay in that hospital a record-breaking 14 days. In the short time between our race from New York to my son's hospitalization, I had lied to get him into treatment. And I had bullied people to keep him in it. And just when things couldn't get worse, they did. I got a call from the Fairfax County Police Department. My son was charged with 2 felonies, breaking and entering, and destruction of property. I was so frustrated. The law had kept me from helping it. Now it wanted to punish him. I said to my wife, Patty, one night, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. She said, why don't you do what you do best? Pete Earley, a father, can't find out much, but Pete Earley, a reporter, can. Why don't you investigate this? Well, for once, I actually listened to my wife. That's my only joke, so I'm glad you got it, okay? And what I discovered was what happened to Kevin is not some aberration. Right now in this country, 2.2 million people with mental illnesses are booked into jail every year. 367,000 people with serious mental illness are sitting in our jails and prisons. More than 1 million are on probation. 40% of persons with serious mental illness will have a serious encounter with law enforcement. 49% of all police shootings involve persons with mental illness. Persons with serious mental illness are 16 times more likely to be fatally shot by the police. Persons with serious mental illness stay in jails 4 to 8 times longer. than others charged with the same crimes. Persons with serious mental illness have a higher likelihood of getting additional charges pressed against them while they're in jail. Persons with mental illness cost 7 times more than anyone else to incarcerate, and they have a recidivism rate that is 15% higher than the national average. 85% of persons with serious mental illness who end up in jail will return to that jail. And in Michigan today, if you have a breakdown like my son, the chances of you getting help in a hospital and ending up in one of your jails is 4 to 1 in favor of jail. Well, those statistics gave me an idea, but first I wanted to talk to Kevin. I said, look, I'm thinking about writing a book about you. And he looked at me and said, well, who'd want to read that? I said, no, I'm going to find a jail far away from Fairfax County because I don't want to irritate a judge or a prosecutor. I'm going to go in that jail and I'm going to spend time following people through the system to see what really happens to them. Then I'll come back and I'll talk to the jailers and the parents and the judges and the correctional officers and the psychiatrists and see what's going on. He said, Dad, if it helps someone else, tell my story. Well, I began in LA. It's always publicized as the biggest public mental health facility in the United States. Lasted 2 days before they threw me out, claiming I was violating HIPAA. They just didn't want me to see what was happening. I tried Chicago next. They said no. Rikers Island next. They said no. Baltimore next. They said no. I tried Washington, D.C., my hometown, and they said hell no. And I ended up in Miami-Dade because of a judge, Steve Lightman, who said, I want you to come down here and see what's going on in our jail. Let me take you to the 9th floor. Let me take you to C Wing, suicide wing. There are 19 cells. The officers walk up and down the center. All the cells have plexiglass. And because of a design flaw, the cold air blows in, but it's stopped by the plexiglass. So it's bone-chilling cold. But when you looked in those cells built for 1 or 2 people, there were 4 and 5, and there were no blankets. And because it was an old jail, oftentimes the water didn't work. So you saw people thirsty on medication who were literally drinking from the toilets. And when you walked on that floor, you heard the normal jail sounds. But when you listened closer, you heard a person screaming at some unseen tormentor. And then I heard a thud, thud, thud. Then faster, thud, thud, thud. Then louder, thud, thud, thud. It was one of the inmates running forward, smashing his forehead in the plexiglass. I ain't crazy, he screamed. Well, then quit acting like you are. An unconcerned officer responded. Now, the officers, I spent 10 months there, and the officers said, you know, we call this the forgotten floor. And I thought, well, that's because the people. No, it was also about them. Not one of these officers had received any kind of training to work with anybody who had a mental illness. And when I got to know them better, every one of them candidly admitted to me that they were troublesome employees and their bosses had sent them to work with the crazies because it was the worst job in jail and they were hoping that they would quit. My tour guide was Dr. Joseph Portier, a fabulous doctor. He said to me, this is impossible. People think if you get someone arrested, they'll get help. We don't help people in jail. We're not a hospital. I went with Dr. Portier on his morning rounds. On that morning, there were 92 inmates on the 9th floor. His rounds took us 19 minutes. If you do the math, you'll see we talked to each of those inmates an average of 12 seconds. But Pete, these are criminals. They need to be locked. Oh, do they? Alice Ann Collier, classic case of schizophrenia, the kind of person who used to be in a state hospital. Now we have her back in the community, which is great. But where did she live? She lived in a cardboard box behind a restaurant. And when I checked her record, she'd been arrested 10 times in the last 4 years and never gotten any kind of help. And this time she was in jail because she was walking down the street and her eyes locked with a woman, an elderly woman who was standing at the bus stop. And she screamed, stop stealing my thoughts. And she ran over and she shoved the person, not hard enough to knock her over, but shoved her. And well-meaning witnesses came up and said, oh, get her arrested. Get her arrested. If you get her arrested, she'll get help. Well, help isn't what Alice Ann Collier received. Florida is unique because so many people retire there. It's up to a prosecutor's discretion. They can charge any crime against anyone who's 65 and older as a felony. And because Alice Ann Collier had shoved 2 other people at bus stops, she was charged under that state's 3 strikes law, which meant she faced a mandatory, non-negotiable 5 years in prison. But when she was brought before the judge, he looked down and he said, this woman's not competent, and you have to be competent in our country to be put on. I'm going to send her to the state hospital in Chattahoochee to be made competent. Competent. That's not the same as treatment. Every day, Alice Ann Collier was taken into a room. She was shown 3 chairs. On one was written judge, another one prosecutor, third one defense attorney. And when Alice Ann Collier could tell her keepers who sat in each chair, they checked off a list and said, oh, she's competent, and sent her back. Well, of course, she wasn't competent. And she appeared before that judge, and he said, what are you? I sent you off to be made competent. You go back to Chattahoochee. When I found Alice Ann Collier, she had been traveling between the jail and Chattahoochee 1,151 days, more than 3 years, and had never been brought on trial. Well, I'm an obnoxious reporter. I took my little pen and paper and I went running over, look at what I found, look at what I found, to the state prosecutor. And they told me with no embarrassment, they knew exactly what they were doing with Alice Ann Collier. In fact, they planned to keep her for 5 years, which was the length they could keep her without putting her on trial. Why? Because she was dangerous. Medication didn't seem to help her. And there was no safe place in the entire state of Florida. No treatment programs, no housing programs. So they're keeping her on that bus, sending her back and forth. I'm talking about people whose major crime is they got sick. I'm not talking about Hannibal Lecter serial killers. Consider April Hernandez, same age as my son. Correctional officers came up to me and said, hey, Pete, you should investigate that case. She was framed. Who framed April Hernandez? Her own parents conspired with relatives to have her arrested for car theft. Why? Because she was homeless, she was psychotic, she was living on the streets of South Beach, where she had been gang raped twice and beaten up 3 times by gangs of teenagers who thought it was hilarious to beat up someone who was homeless, and there was nothing her parents could do about it because she was not considered a danger to herself and others. Now, what's interesting about April Hernandez is that everybody thought she was homeless in this way because she started using drugs. It was only after she was correctly diagnosed as having co-occurring problems that they realized, yeah, she had an addiction and also a mental illness. And we know that 40% of persons with bipolar disorder have co-occurring problems, and 75% of those with bipolar disorder in our jails and prisons have co-occurring. Finally, I'm going to tell you about Freddie Gilbert. I don't care if you live in beautiful Ann Arbor or Washington, D.C. I walked down State Street today. You have a Freddie Gilbert in your community. A Miami study found that in a population of 2 million, at any given time, there were 1,700 people in that community who were homeless. They were living in cars or on the streets. But that same study found, of those 1,700, all but 507 of them were able to move through our social system into some kind of supportive housing. Those 507 are always homeless. Those 507 all had schizophrenia or bipolar 1. Those 507 all had been arrested more than 2 or 3 times. And when I met Freddie Gilbert in his cell, he was so sick, he could not speak. And the officers controlled him by offering him sandwiches as if he were a dog performing for treats. And when I checked his record, I discovered that he had been in and out of that jail that year alone more than 8 times, but he was always charged with misdemeanors, and so therefore he did not qualify for any programs that he could be entered into. After my book was published, University of Southern Florida's Institute followed 97 folks, these frequent utilizers like Freddie Gilbert. Over a 5-year period, this is what they found. Those 97 individuals were arrested 2,200 times. They spent 27,000 days in jail, 13,000 days in crisis stabilization and emergency rooms. 13,000. They cost that community $13 million, and absolutely none of them were helped. But Pete, you did your book in 2006. Surely things have changed. Yes, we're making progress, but let's not kid ourselves. Last year, Hampton Roads, Virginia, J. Shamil Mitchell, 24-year-old African-American with a mental illness, schizoaffective disorder. He gets picked up on a minor charge. He's taken to jail. There is no room in the state hospital, so his paperwork is put aside. People forget about J. Shamil Mitchell until 101 days later when his dead body is found in a feces-covered cell. Why? What did he die from? Wasting away syndrome. He had lost 48 pounds because the officers were denying him food because he wouldn't obey their instructions. And more shockingly, a private contractor nurse checked on him every day and did nothing to help him. What was his crime? He had taken $5.05 of snacks from a 7-Eleven. And what makes that so outrageous is the jail claimed he was getting good treatment. How do we get in this situation where jails and prisons have become our largest public facility? Well, there are lots of reasons, but the biggest one is we don't have good community care. Let's look at access to mental health care. Most families don't have a family psychiatrist. They go to an emergency room. Did you know the average wait time in an emergency room today, if you have a non-life-threatening illness, is 3 to 4 hours? If you have a non-threatening psychiatric emergency, it's 3 to 4 days. Psychiatric boarding is common across our country. California, you can spend 3 days chained to a gurney. Let's look at access to psychiatrists. If you have one in your community, and many rural communities do not, there's generally a 7 to 10 day wait to get in to see that psychiatrist. Can you imagine having a heart attack and being told to wait 10 days? Even worse, a JAMA study found 89% of doctors will accept private insurance. Only 55% of psychiatrists do. And while nearly 90% of doctors will treat people with Medicare, only 55% of psychiatrists will. And when it comes to Medicaid, less than 40% will see someone. The truth is that many psychiatrists do not want to treat the Freddie Gilberts. They want to treat the worried well. Let's look at housing. Fairfax County, where I live, is one of the wealthiest counties in America. The average household income is $157,000 compared to $47,000 national. That's because everybody works for the government, so thank you very much. You would think with that kind of income, man, you'd have great. Do you know there's a 5 to 17 year wait in Fairfax if you have a mental illness to get any kind of housing? Let's go back to Miami quickly. Not everyone who has a mental illness in Miami is sitting in the jail. There were 4,500 people when I did my research who were living in assisted living facilities, boarding homes. They lived in 650 boarding homes. But let's look at those 650. Only 250 of them could pass the minimum standards to operate as a boarding home. In other words, if you put anyone except someone with a mental illness in 400 of them, it would have been against the law. The one I visited had a hole in the roof, rain poured through, medications were scattered on a kitchen table. There was no case management. The caretaker only spoke Spanish. None of the tenants spoke Spanish. And there was no help, no therapy. There was nothing but people smoking cigarettes and watching TV. And I would argue in this incident, we really haven't helped these people. We're just hiding them better. Well, it's easy for me to pick on these slumlords. When I did my research, the operator of an assisted living facility in Miami got paid $29.90 per day for every tenant. That covered all their costs. Do you know, and you can tell I live in the Washington area, when I travel with my dog, I travel in the Dulles Executive Pet Center, and I leave my dog there. And the Executive Center charges me $36 to walk my dog, give my dog medication, and board it. In other words, we pay $6 more to take care of my dog than what we're taking care of people with schizophrenia and bipolar. That's why I call my book Crazy. I'm not talking about people like my son. I'm talking about our system that waits until we reach stage 4 and then would rather arrest people than give them help. Because our mental health care system can't help us, can't meet the need, we're turning to the criminal justice system to solve this. And Michigan is very typical. The first thing that happens is there's a tragedy, so we say we need better police training. Nationally, we have what's called Stepping Up campaign. And that's a commitment by your commissioners and leaders of your community to seek jail diversion and police treatment. It's called Stepping Up. And your county, the people in charge of your county have signed a resolution saying they're going to do that. And the state of Michigan has insisted on crisis intervention team training. managing mental health care crisis, which you have in your county, Michigan crisis intervention system, and mental health first aid for all police officers. You have 20 mental health courts that are designed to help people get into treatment. And these programs are so successful, they help people, and they also make sense because they save tax dollars. But I'm going to tell you something. If I had a broken leg, I wouldn't call up your police department and tell you, hey, come fix it. If I needed heart surgery, I wouldn't call up your sheriff and say, give me a new heart. And if I had nasty, nasty hemorrhoids, I wouldn't call up a judge and say, hey, judge, can you come over and take a look? So why are we depending on law enforcement to fix what is a community mental health problem? If we really want to do that, we need to wake up and understand that we need to create a system that avoids law enforcement contact. We need to wake up and stand. You can't talk about mental health recovery unless you want to talk about supportive housing. You can't get better if you're sleeping outside. We need to wake up and understand you can't fix the system unless you want to talk about jobs that give people a purpose in life and pride. You can't fix it unless you want to talk about crisis care beds where people can get immediate help when they need it. You can't talk about it unless you talk about transportation because people need to move to jobs and housing. You can't fix it unless you want to talk about drug and alcohol treatment programs, and you can't talk about it unless you want to talk about PTSD. 20 veterans a day take their own life, and did you know for the third year in a row, more police officers have ended their own lives than died in the line of duty. And you can't talk about it unless you want to do social connectivity. You can't have people sitting in housing, smoking cigarettes, watching TV, and not have any communication with other people. And finally, you can't talk about it unless you want to talk about giving people hope. That's right, hope. Hal Lindsey said, man can live 40 days without food, 3 days without water, 8 minutes without air, and 1 second without hope. How do I know that collaboration, community-wide support, and bringing everyone together on a common purpose works? Because in the last 13 years, Judge Leifman has completely reformed his system. Just last year, he closed down the 9th floor. He has a drop-off center. He has job counselors. He has people who can go into apartments. He provides wraparound services. And what has been the result? The result has arrests have decreased from 118,000 to 56,000. Recidivism has dropped by 50%. Jail population plunged from 7,300 to 4,000. And Miami actually closed one of its jails, saving $12 million. But I don't have to cite Miami to tell you what works. Let me tell you about Kevin. For 6 years, he was trapped on this treadmill, in and out in jail, tasered by police, in and out of hospitals. The last time he got sick was Thanksgiving. And he could tell I knew he was off his meds, and he didn't want me calling the police and getting tasered. So he jumped in his car, and he took off, and he started driving. And I started calling and calling and calling and calling. And finally he answered, and I said, where are you going? Where are you going? I'm going to heaven, Dad. Well, that's not real reassuring to a parent. Well, he got as far as North Carolina, and he ran out of gas. And he called me. I said, okay, I'll come. He said, no, Dad, don't come. Well, go get some gas. No, Dad, you don't understand. The voices are telling me if I step out of this car, I'm going to die. Now, we all know that's nonsense. But if your mind was telling you that we walked out of this room, we'd all die, gosh, we'd get to know each other really, really well. So I did what no father should do. I arranged for him to get gas. He drove up psychotic, 95, went off the road twice. Luckily, didn't hit anybody, didn't get arrested by the police. And he came home. And by this time, I had listened to the experts, and they had told me, be his partner, not his parent. Don't try to force him, talk to him. So I said, son, I'm so tired of this. How can I help? I don't want to take medication. I heard there's a safe house in Fairfax where I can go and just think, great, I'll drive you there. Arranged to get him in, drove off, left him. So what happened that night? At night, he got up and he took off all his clothes because when you take off your clothes, you become invisible. And he went walking out. But listen to what happened. A crisis intervention team police officer saw him and said, hey, buddy, this isn't really too safe walking naked down the street. Don't Arrest me. I'm not a criminal. Why don't we go over to the emergency room? Don't handcuff me. That's when I get tasered. I'm not a criminal. The officer used his discretion. He put Kevin in the back seat. Then he turned to him and he said, what kind of music you like? I love rap. Okay, he turned on a rap station. He got to the emergency room, same hospital where I had been rejected. And he took him in and he stayed with him. And that doctor said, well, it's not dangerous to be walking around naked. He said, oh, really, Dr. Smith? I'm going to look up where you live and drop him off on your front yard. All of a sudden, my son was admitted into that hospital. And then a miracle happened. He got a case manager, a fabulous, fabulous woman. And she made sure he wasn't pushed out the door. And she said to him, Kevin, why don't you take your meds? I've gained 50 pounds. I feel like a slug. I can't drink beer. I can't have sex. Let's find you a doctor to work with you. Do you know my son's 7 psychiatrists, only 2 have ever bothered to learn anything but his name and symptoms, and that's because they're going to get paid for a 15-minute check, and they're going to prescribe a pill and shove him out the door. But treating the mind requires treating the heart, treating people like people. And this doctor asked him, and they worked together, and they found a medication. You ask my son today, you say, I don't have any side effects. And then that case manager said, you shouldn't be living with your dad. Now, I didn't know how to take that. And I thought, this is stupid. We got a big house. He can live. No, he's old enough. He needs to be on his own. And she put him in housing first, told him he had to pay 30% of his income if he had 0 or whatever, with 2 guys with schizophrenia. And I was stunned at what it did to him, because he was more than 30 years old and he was living in an apartment away from his parents, and he was proud of that. And then she said, Kevin, what are you going to do with your life? Oh, what can I do? I have a mental illness. Knock it off. Control the illness. Don't let it control you. So my son got a job, college educated, super high IQ. He was the boy at Home Depot who picked up carts. And he got depressed. All his friends were moving on, having families, getting promotion, and he's picking up carts. And his case manager sees him one day and said, man, Kevin, you are doing great. And he thought she was mocking. He said, no, you are. Come to my group. Come talk to people. So he did. And he found out he was doing great. And all of a sudden, he went from somebody who needed help to somebody who could help others. And he loved it. And she said, I have the perfect job for you. It's called being a peer support specialist, a person with mental illness who helps someone with mental illness. So he took all the courses. My son today works as a peer-to-peer specialist in Arlington County. Now, let me brag about him. A guy over 300 pounds, schizophrenia, been in his parents' basement, won't come out. My son met with him, finally got him out for lunch. Went to McDonald's, not my choice. And that's not a big deal unless that's your son. Today, my son works full-time. He's buying a house with my ex-wife. He is going to graduate school to become a master's degree in social work. He's paying taxes and complaining about it, which is a sure sign of his sanity. And I'm tremendously proud of him. So don't tell me people with bipolar can never get better, because they can. How do we make this happen? You need to look to your right and you need to look to your left. I'm going to ask you a question. Who will demand that we stop locking up our loved ones with serious mental illness for nuisance crimes related to their illnesses? Who will demand that people with serious mental illnesses be given opportunities, not stigmatized? Who will demand that insurance companies and our healthcare system treat broken minds the same way they treat broken bodies? Who will join this family in supporting research that will unlock the mysteries of bipolar and find better medications and understanding these cruel illnesses? Who will fight for that person in a solitary confinement cell who is ranting and raving? Who will fight for people who die 15 years earlier because they're kept in solitary? Who's going to fight for the homeless psychotic man on the street, the teen cutting herself, the college student hearing voices, the woman standing on the edge of a bridge about to jump? Will you? Margaret Mead said it best. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I grew up in Oklahoma. My dad was a preacher, and I've just told you everything you need to know. I got dragged to church every Wednesday and twice on Sunday. And I got really good at sitting there like this, not hearing a word my father said. Unless he told one story. It's about a woman having sex. They're in the Bible. You just got to know where to look. You might know this story. A woman is caught in adultery, and please notice it's always the women who are caught in adultery in the Bible, never the men. And they drag her in the center of the city. They're going to stone her. They're going to kill her because of this horrible thing that she has done. And we read that the teacher picks up a stone and says, "Let ye who's never sinned throw that very first stone." And we read that the people put down the rocks and they put down the stones. They walk away because they know all of us have sinned. All of us have done things we're not proud of. Sadly, we live in a world today where people don't want to put down those rocks. They want to lock up people who are different, lock up people who are homeless, lock up people who have drug problems. Just get them off our streets, get rid of them. My friend Brian Stevenson talks about stone catchers, people who stand between the angry mobs and people who can't defend themselves, and they catch those stones until these people are strong enough to join them. And it is the stone catchers in our society who give me hope. I am the parent of an adult son with mental illness. What does that mean? What does it feel like? It means seeing my son not giving a second chance, but a third, fourth, and fifth chance. What does it mean being the parent of an adult son with a mental illness? Learning about resilience and incredible human spirit. It means learning from my son, becoming his partner as well as his parent, and watching him succeed despite the roadblocks that we throw in front of him. What is it like to be the parent of a serious mental illness? Our journey has given me a purpose and giving him a purpose too. And I'm tremendously proud of the person my son has become. And my goal is to have other sons and daughters and family members get the same kind of help Kevin got, even if their parents or loved ones don't know Mike Wallace or have worked at the Washington Post. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for being a stone catcher. You can make a difference. Get involved. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very kind. Now, thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Now I'd like to introduce you to my son. Bipolar disorder is where you have wild rushes of mania and big pumps of depression that follow afterwards. One moment your mind is racing and one moment you feel like you're brilliant or you're touched by God or you can solve all these equations. Moment you're very sad and you're crying, depressed, and you want to get out of bed. Being vacillates between the two. My son's first sign that he had wrong was the comet, which is when he's often alert. That can very erratically. I was doing days without sleep. I had these puzzles in my mind that I was trying to decode, and everything was sort of like a mystery to me. And was trying to put these seemingly random things into some sort of order of a comet. All that happened. It was good 5 years before I finally came to
ago, best friend was a 2 years pregnant and more family explained when I was somebody we were talking to. We found him and just like worried about him. We weren't planning on telling anyone. We wanted to tell him that it was really important because we were so excited to have a new uncle that we wanted. No, we just told him we wanted him to be around about us. And like by that time, I think we were knowing he already had the bipolar diagnosis. Reading more about it and reading more about other people's stories and things that they've gone through, just like, gosh, I hope that was together.
2012, I was approached by Jennifer Marshall, and she's somebody who I was in support groups with, and she had this idea to put together a show called This Is My Break. Show where people speak through writing and poetry and music, how they can express their ordeals or their triumphs. I created an original rap song for her show, and in 2014, 300 people, and I got a standing ovation. It was very inspiring point in my recovery.
As a peer-to-peer specialist, he helps the mentally ill in Fairfax County. He works with police departments to help them better understand how to interact with people with mental illnesses. Evan will perform his original rap song, Brave.
First time that I made a song about mental illness, it was a song I made called Mental Hospital. And after I made it, get to speak my experience into the world and get it out there. Now that I've overcome it, I can look back at it, and even though there were very tragic incidents, there were things that happened that I probably wish never had happened, made me who I am today and made me stronger. I'm grateful for the experience because it's given me a purpose and a professional duty, and plan on going to school to study social work and becoming a social worker.
These speakers are really quiet.
I hope people get out. Should be boring. No shame. As a social worker, are suffering, struggling, like I was suffering.
22.
As you do, come to terms with their mental illness, improve condition, and the battles that I've been through, dealing with police, and being arrested. So my goal is to make their lives better and help.
Oh, yep, I can do that, right? I think. Let me, oh, I got it.
Got it, testing? Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We really appreciate it. The video was tremendous. I see we have another star that we can bring to Ann Arbor.
Hey, you
here
can.
in the music. That would be great. So, again, thank you very much, Pete, for your presentation. Now, we have cards that have been going around, and so we have individuals going to collect the 3x5 cards to bring your questions up for Pete. And we'll have approximately 10 minutes, and we'll have questions addressed to him, bringing the cards up here, and I will collate the questions and bring them forward to you. But I have a question. You've traveled considerably, both in the country and internationally. And so I'm interested to know what you have learned in your international travels that you feel might be beneficial for the system here in the United States.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say I'm from Washington, so I'm good at saying a lot, not saying anything, so beware. I think the most poignant trip I made was to Portugal, a country that's 96% Roman Catholic. They did not have any of the facilities that we had, but no one was scared of mental hospitals. They don't have the baggage we have with our horrible one flew over the cuckoo's nest background. And it was just so enlightening to see people go, well, of course we go to the mental hospital. You have something wrong with your mind, you go to the mental hospital. Without, all you had to do is, if you say to somebody, Children's Hospital, everybody goes, oh, State Hospital, ooh. And that's some of the baggage we have. And what I've discovered is that every country has to deal, I think Australia does it best, deal with the civil rights issue. When are you going to impose your will on someone else? And no country seems to know. But most countries have a right to treatment, saying we have a responsibility to treat you, as opposed to the United States, which says we will not treat you unless you get to stage 4 where you're dangerous. And I'll tell you, that was originally passed to keep people from being abused. Now it's passed as an excuse not to provide treatment. You can have people go into a hospital and say, I'm suicidal, and they'll say, well, why don't you sit there? And 20 minutes later, well, obviously you're not suicidal, so we don't have to admit you.
Thank you. So one of the questions here directly for you is related to your experiences in Dade County. And the question is, what was the secret sauce of the judge to make these changes? And one of the things that I was most touched by your point was that it's small groups that make changes. It's individuals that make changes. It's people like you that make changes. It's people like that judge. How do they do it? And how can we model our actions after these?
Well, you're doing it. I mean, you're doing it right here, right now. And Judge Lightman, as I've traveled across the country, what you find are pockets of brilliance, but there's no one pulling them all together. If you go to San Antonio, you'll find great jail diversion. And what Judge Lightman did, if you go to Phoenix, they have what they call an air traffic controller system, where you don't call 911, you call a number, and that person's trained to say, okay, you need a therapist, I'm setting up an appointment for you tomorrow. Okay, you need a mobile crisis. A strong leader, okay? You got to have
a good microphone.
The last few years, the driving force has not been advocates. It's been sheriffs and judges, and they don't want them in jail, right? You got to have a strong leader that can force everybody to. I was appointed to a federal panel There are 8 agencies in the federal government. They run 155 different programs, and none of them want to talk to each other. And that's why I don't believe it's going to come from the top down. So Leifman was able to pull all the people together, have them sit down, and then force them to begin cooperating and working towards, some of this is not rocket science. When you have a police officer, and you have them trained with mental health, and they take that person to an emergency room and they have to sit there 5 hours, they're not going to do it because it takes them 15 minutes to book somebody in jail. So it takes collaboration, cooperation. You can drop somebody off and do the exchange of custody. I mean, these are things that can be worked through, but you got to get people incentivized to want to do it. And one last comment, and then I'll get next question. When I go talk to our leaders, I don't talk about emotion. There are people in this audience who have worse stories than me, but I'm telling you, the next person through the door has breast cancer. The next person through the door has Down syndrome. The next person through the door wants better schools. Nobody wants to help people in jails and prisons. I talk about money. You know, it costs, I forget, I looked it up, it's like $36,000 a year to keep someone in Michigan, which is actually really low to keep somebody in jail and prisons. Do you know the average is 2/3 of that? You can get somebody with housing first and treatment. So you got to talk numbers to them.
So one final question before we'll shortly call the panel up. Are there any laws or political initiatives that are ongoing right now, policy issues that we should be supporting or specifically following? I understand the Supreme Court is working on a case right now or shortly.
Well, I'm not an expert on the Supreme Court cases. The Trump administration has brought in a more conservative view in mental health, and they were trying to do something with HIPAA, which most parents really want done, but is being fought by a lot of consumer groups. They want to have more assisted outpatient treatment, which some people see as sports medication. They want to do, one thing they have succeeded in doing is, because of our horrific history with state hospitals, we impose what's called the IMD exclusion, Institutions of Mental Disease, where we said we never want anybody to get stuck in these. So the largest you can be is 16 beds. If you have more than 16 beds, we won't give you any federal money, no Medicaid. And most people who are really sick are on Medicaid, okay? The Trump administration has lifted that. All you have to do is get your state to apply for a waiver, and they can operate larger facilities than 16 beds. But only a handful of states have done it because of fears that we're going to go back to the old state hospital. And one last comment on that. We want to give everybody hope, but let's don't kid ourselves. The doctor and I were talking about this last night. It used to be called the rule of thirds, where you can help a third won't change, and a third you cannot help. We have people in our jails and prisons who want to get better, and we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to help them. And that's why what you're doing here with bipolar, with your research, gives me hope, because we have to find a way to help those people.
Thank you. So I just in the interest of time, I'm going to call upon the panel just to come and be seated. And I just want to have a few words, a little bit about the progress and the work that we're doing as the panel is being seated. So we're just maximizing the use of our time. Thank you. So Pete can just to join the panel, try to get the panel organized. You can take a seat here up in the panel, Pete, as well. And so, again, I just wanted to welcome you again to the 14th lecture series that we're having to commemorate the memory of Heinz Prechter. And I want to tell you just a little bit about the research that we're doing. The longitudinal study was mentioned in the video, and it forms the core of our research. And so we have a central core of clinical research that is going on, and numerous nodes that are connecting to the core. So the core, we have two primary themes in our course. One is to identify mechanisms of how bipolar disorder, what causes bipolar disorder, with the purpose. And I've learned an interesting concept. It's called question zero. Question zero is, what do you actually hope to accomplish with this work? And so question zero for us is exactly, what is the mechanism, the biological mechanism or mechanisms behind bipolar disorder? And we're working with really smart people in the stem cell lab in pharmacology, psychology, and computer science to get to the bottom of what causes bipolar disorder so we can identify novel and more efficient ways to treat the illness. The second theme that we pursue in the question 0, and that is, how can we predict, how can we anticipate when problems are emerging, how can we identify the course of the illness and describe the course of the illness in computational and biological terms to be able to understand, like we understand in diabetes, what causes or what the features of the illness are. So I'm very excited that we're hosting here in Ann Arbor a meeting at the end of this month, begin the formation of a global bipolar cohort. So one of the things that we hear from everybody is we need to collaborate more. We need to work together. And so we have individuals coming, top research scientists in bipolar disorder coming from Canada, from Germany, from the UK, from Spain, from China and Australia, and here in the US, to come together to really work and focus on what is the way forward that we're going to be working on. So that will help us generate a large amount of data, big data, and just big ideas, big data, and a lot of energy to solve these problems. So with that, I want to again welcome the panel and thank you for being seated as I was just describing briefly what we're doing. So I want to start with introductions. I'm going to start on the other end there and to introduce yourself. So Wendy, we'll start with you.
Can you hear me now? My name is Wendy, and I'm a research participant. I've been part of the original first few years of the study.
Thank you. And I just want to remind everyone to be filling out your 3x5 cards with the questions and raise your hand, and the assistants will bring them up to the front of the stage. Thank you. Maria.
My name is Maria Bastida. I'm a nurse practitioner at the University of Michigan, and I work in the bipolar clinic.
I'm Charles Graham. I'm a clinical social worker and psychologist at the Addictions Treatment Services, which is a subcomponent of the Department of Psychiatry with Michigan Medicine.
Hi, I'm Dr. Deborah Pinels. I am with the University of Michigan as a clinical professor of psychiatry, and I also direct the program in psychiatry, law, and ethics. And as part of my role, I serve in Michigan as the state medical director for behavioral health and forensic programs, and I work very intimately with the very issues that Pete was describing about the justice and behavioral health interface, both in Michigan and around the country.
Yeah, you've all been, and Pete has introduced himself. So I want to start out with the questions. And so what I like to do is to receive the questions from the audience. And several of them, often they have a similar theme. And so I'll group them together and often paraphrase the questions so that we can get through all the questions as they come up. There's a number of questions here about how we work with individuals to get them to accept their diagnosis. What are the strategies that we would potentially use in order to motivate individuals to accept their diagnosis and work with their treatment team and identify strategies going forward. And so I'll give you a break for a moment, Pete, on this, and just open it up to the panel. And Wendy, we haven't heard from you so much. I'd like for you to start out this conversation. What is your advice to families on that topic?
I think that it took a while for me to accept my diagnosis. And I think if my family were to tell me that I had an issue, I wouldn't necessarily have believed them. I think you kind of have to go from where they're coming from. I think it took my second manic episode to realize, well, this is not just a random occurrence. This is something that's really, I have the diagnosis. And I do think that it helps to be in contact with mental health professionals that can help to guide you through the process and not just have like family members telling you that you have the illness.
Yeah, so Charles, do you want to come and comment on that? Thank you as well.
So I think it really matters. It has a lot to do with the individual and their own personal perception of the illness themselves. We know that there are individuals who would rather see their illness as a part of them. So I'm someone who has this illness, but it's not me. While there are others who have found a significant sense of empowerment to identify themselves as one with the illness. And I think that's a really important part of understanding self-ascription and how a person sees the illness, whether or not it informs them about who they are and who they can become, or whether or not it's an element apart from who they are that ultimately interferes, disrupts. And so I think in the communication, in the working with individuals, it's about really hearing their voice, trying to get a sense of what they think the illness means and what role it may possibly play in their lived experience.
Thank you. So I have a series of questions related to the healthcare and the healthcare industry, essentially. And one thought's on the universal healthcare, the potential for universal healthcare, which would be Medicare for all. And there was another question regarding the motivation of healthcare systems to provide healthcare, and so implying that there's not as much money to be made, if you will, from the mentally ill. So what can be done policy-wise, kind of top down, if you will? And so, Dr. Pinels, I'll ask you to start that discussion.
Sure, that's an easy and apolitical thing to ask. Well, I mean, I think we're we have so much work to do, and it's so interesting to see again the year that your book was written, and to see we have come so far, but yet we have so much further to go. And so, without answering the universal health care question, which is the question facing America many times over, I think what we're trying to do from a policy perspective and understand more is the role of integrated care, and understanding that if we don't address mental illness, we will cost our society more money generally. And so although traditionally it's been kind of the lowest on the totem pole of healthcare in terms of the prioritization, we are in a wave right now where it is being recognized, both mental health care and substance use, obviously, unfortunately, in part driven by the opioid crisis. But we are starting to recognize more and more that these are the very conditions that drive medical care costs as well. You talked about the chance of dying 20 years earlier if you have serious mental illness. I mean, there's so many things that drive cost in our society, and for a long time, mental health care was not attended to efficiently. So I think we're on a wave where some of that is changing. We also have some laws and policies that hopefully will help drive this further. Parity, that's a really important issue. Network adequacy rules to make sure that people have access to providers wherever they are. Those are all important policy things that are starting to hopefully move that needle in a better direction.
So there's a point about the parity law. I mean, is this is a law requiring equal treatment? How does that work in practice? I mean, the impression sometimes that is given is that there's a parity law, but for example, at the University of Michigan, sometimes an individual will be able to get their heart transplant in the university system, but their insurance company does not pay for mental health care. So there's a parity law, but there's kind of, from a clinician's perspective, kind of cracks in that parity law.
Oh, again, I would say we've come far. We're not far enough. There's, certainly challenges and litigation that's going on, trying to look at where there might still be need for more effort. So we're not there yet. But even just passing that concept that mental health care deserves the same level of care as medical surgical care, that was a major policy decision for our country that didn't exist before.
Yep.
There's more work to do.
Yep. Now, so I went for Maria to start the discussion on what would the features of a good mental health system look like, and from a nurse perspective, a nurse practitioner's perspective, how are we going to get there? I mean, from you're working day in day out in the clinic and seeing what the challenges are. What would be the ideal system? What would it look like?
I wish I could put that together. I think that part of an ideal healthcare system to treat mental illness would be working on some of the stigma that still exists. I think that that might be something that is a barrier for people coming into mental health clinics. They were talking about integrative care, and I know that sometimes some of our psychiatrists are going to primary care clinics. And I think that might be a good idea because it might be easier, more comfortable for the person to go to a primary care clinic and see a psychiatrist there, rather than going to see a psychiatry clinic. And I wish that I could prescribe medication, the medication that I want to prescribe to the patient. I wish I could see the patient as many times as I think is necessary, for as long as I believe is necessary. Those might be lofty and unrealistic goals, but I think there's somewhere we can meet in the middle. So I feel as if I'm providing the best care that I can for everybody who walks, into my office.
So really working on enabling really dedicated people in the clinic. And so, Wendy, do you have any perspectives on that?
Yeah, when I was first diagnosed, I was living out of state, and I ended up moving back here due to my illness and trying to get back on my feet. And I have to say that I really appreciate the work the Depression Center has done as far as more comprehensive care. It's not just it's a nurse practitioner that can deal with medication and a therapist that can deal with all the issues that I'm going through. That it really does make a difference to have that variety of care, but it is a struggle because I work for the University of Michigan with good insurance, but at first I could only get a certain amount of appointments per year, and that got extended and extended. Yeah. But even having good insurance doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to get.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the most important things that we like to stress is that the management of bipolar disorder, as in any medical illness, is really the collaboration between the individual with the illness and the people bearing the treatment responsibility. Pete, your ideal system, what does it look like?
Well, let's look at what we know works. Let's look at the serious mental illness. 5 to 7% of those with mental health problems, and they eat up 50% of mental health dollars. We know with chronic, like Freddie Gilbert, the first step is housing, and hospitals are beginning to realize this. Under the Obamacare, hospitals were penalized for people coming back in quickly back to hospitals. This year, more than $100 million will be spent by hospitals to build respite care facilities, housing for as long as 21 days next to hospitals. Second thing you see most successful is an ACT team, a team that goes to the person. But the key in all this is meeting the person where there is. This is why I like peers so much. Developing continuity of care, somebody who cares. That's why we defeat the purpose. I know all families aren't great. I know some families are a pain. So people have a right not to have their family breathing down their neck. But when you have social connectivity with the family, pushing them out is bad. When you have that social connectivity with the family or somebody who cares, whether it's a peer or loved one, you're going to have a higher degree of success. So I can name cities where they have this program and this program and this program, but ultimately, look at the LAMP project. You saw the Soloist in California, taking people who have been homeless for years, 80% recovery rate. 80% of those people get into housing, get an ACT team. They still, after 5 years, are still in that housing including life. And that's because they debunked the myth that, oh, everyone wants to live outside and be homeless.
It's very encouraging, and it just teaches us that that humanity responds to humanity. I mean, it's really a fundamental element. So, Charles, I have a question, and it's the medical marijuana, kind of topic that always comes up in this thing. So, so it's firstly around. Is it good? And then how do you encourage a loved one to discontinue marijuana as a self-medication, and with the understanding that marijuana can sabotage? And so there's two questions here on the poll of medical marijuana and how can you is it of any consequence or use, and how can you persuade people not to elect to use medical marijuana? I was going to say, I promised you that I would save the good ones for you. Yeah, the light is on. It should work. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very big question. I'm going to try to keep myself out of trouble here in response. In general, I think there needs to be clarity as to what is meant when people use the concept of medical marijuana. I think it's broadly defined. What is being used for medicinal purposes may vary supposedly from those. I work primarily with young people, young adults, who will argue that the marijuana that they're using is medicinal and is helping them, when in fact it has no medical oversight whatsoever. So I think that's an important piece, first of all, is to get clarity as to what is broadly meant. There is still a whole lot of uncertainty about the significant, or I should say the literature is still out there about the positive effects of utilizing marijuana with a fully developed brain. We do know, however, for young people and adolescents, there's by far more evidence of the contradictory factor of using when, in fact, a person is being prescribed medication and is in an effort of trying to get better. So what we try to talk a little bit about is what is the person trying to achieve? Sometimes use induces problems, and sometimes people are using to deal with problems. And to understand the motivation oftentimes is the way to kind of get individuals to think about other alternatives to use. Sometimes the stress of the illness can be so overwhelming. People are trying very hard to deal with the significant elements of the affective component, negative affective components of the illness. And they're using, believing that it's the only source to getting some sense of solace, and offering options and other ways of dealing and helping people to understand the overall course has been, I found, very effective in getting people to trust the idea that the total reliance on marijuana in particular, psychoactive piece, is probably not the best, and it's not the only solution to remedying their problem. That's a short form of addressing the question.
Do anyone else want to comment on that? I have a question for Dr. Pinals here, and it is, what is happening in Michigan that might correspond to what they did in Miami-Dade? And then the question of, what, and it's kind of related, to what extent do bar associations and other associations of lawyers work to address the problems in law enforcement that we've identified tonight? So it's a kind of a global picture. How do we address the issues here in our home?
Well, I was really glad you did your homework to hear about what's happening in Michigan. There is a lot happening in Michigan. In fact, Judge Leifman was just here about 3 weeks ago. He came to Wayne County. Wayne County has a diversion council that they're starting where they're trying to look at, and several of us went on a delegation to go down to Miami-Dade to take the best practices from Miami and bring them to Michigan. We have at the state level the Mental Health Diversion Council. that was established under Governor Snyder and has continued under Governor Whitmer. We have a number of different pilot communities that we are funding to look at programs and services that can be developed both using the Stepping Up initiative as well as something called the sequential intercept model. Washtenaw County is actually a lead in the state in many ways for having some of its work done. The Managing Mental Health Crisis training that you spoke about was a training that I worked on when I was working in Massachusetts. That's been a training that's been given to over 14,000 officers in the state of Massachusetts. And we brought it over to Michigan. Here in Washtenaw County was the pilot community to pilot that. That's also been picked up by the Mental Health Diversion Council. And then Western Michigan University is doing the Michigan Crisis Intervention Specialist training. We have CIT initiatives, the crisis intervention, to get officers similar to the one that you were describing in that situation with your son. So there is a lot going on. We're working with courts in looking at specialty courts. We're developing reentry services for people coming out of jails and prisons. Washtenaw County actually passed a millage where the community said, yes, it was a very interesting solution. And actually, there's a couple of counties in Michigan where the communities themselves, through grassroots, are saying, you know, the state is doing this, the counties can do this, but we still want more for our community, and the communities have decided to pass millages. And in the millage in Washtenaw County, for example, is a combined, the money is going in a combined way to public safety and community mental health to develop best practices. So there's a whole lot going on in Michigan.
Yeah, so this all costs money, and so many of us, heard on the news that there was just a resolution voted. They're actually decreasing the funding for mental health care in Washtenaw County, and that is what I heard. What is happening there? I mean, the getting news is often very challenging these days.
Well, I mean, we're all watching the budget scenario unfold, and we'll see what happens with the governor's budget in Michigan. There's many things going on. And there are various times where there's allocations of funding and recalculations. We have fund at the state level, funding goes to each community, and it has to be apportioned in a certain way. And so there are frequently issues around how to make sure that proportionality is fair and reasonable for the population and the need. So I think it's an evolving picture in terms of what's happening.
It's, as we noticed, politics is certainly an evolving picture. So I have a series of questions here that relate to the sort of early development of bipolar disorder and is early detection and earlier intervention, is it possible? And also to look at something that I think is incredibly interesting, and that is how bipolar disorder changes over the course of time. And so you have, teenage years, you have people in their 20s, the college age in the 20s, and then the young professionals and that. So firstly, starting out with, how do we detect earlier? How do we start to understand how the illness, evolves? And so Dr. Graham, Dr. Graham, do you want to perhaps start on that? How do we approach the issues with early detection? And I'll ask others to join in on this very important topic.
Yeah, so I think it's extremely important. It is sometimes a very hard way of trying to answer.
Leave it on.
I think that's an extremely important question because of the role that illness plays in the developing body, especially with young people who in many ways may experience wide ranges of emotions, inconsistency in their overall disposition. It's really important that they understand what is the difference between something that may just be tangential to who they are versus something that is beginning to show as an emergent quality of their overall well-being. And so I think it's important to kind of continue to have open communication. I had a young person who for many, many, many months was experiencing psychosis and kept it silent. And whenever he would experience it, to the degree that he could control it, he really kind of went into complete seclusion because he had absolutely no understanding of what was going on with him. And it wasn't until some health education teacher explaining symptoms of sort that he recognized that what she was saying is something that I'm experiencing quite regularly, and given an understanding of that piece was actually the opening to him to be able to confidentially share with someone what was going on personally with him. So I think the important piece is education, the opportunity to communicate, and a real good clarity about the developmental cycle of the illness so that people can understand whether or not what they're experiencing is that which can be explained developmentally versus that which is developing early.
Thank you. And so, Pete, I'm interested to hear your perspective. So now you have watched your son over 20, 25 years, evolving with the illness. What changes over, the various different time periods of development of a young adult have you been aware of or noticed? Yeah, Pete, yeah. Hold the microphone so they can...
My wife and I spent a lot of time looking backward, trying to figure out if there were clues and signs we missed. And we didn't see too many. And how the disease progressed was it got progressively worse. And it kept escalating and escalating. I'm not sure I'm answering your question because there were all of a sudden there were obvious signs. I mean, my son was a health nut, and he'd start drinking. He'd get up in the morning, immediately have a drink, and he'd go to bed with a drink. So he was self-medicating that way. There was one of the things we learned was there's this conception that if somebody has got a mental illness, they're 24 hours psychotic. And there would be times when he would be psychotic, and then he would kind of like snap out of it, and we'd think, well, whoa, and then he'd get even worse. I think the biggest issue for most parents, at least from my perspective, is trying to work with somebody and get them to accept that they're ill. And your comments earlier about that is how you position that. And my son finally woke up and said, I can't deny this anymore. And then there were other factors, but that's the hardest. I think from a parent's perspective, the hardest thing is accepting the fact you may not be able to save your son. And in fact, you may have to have your child hate you to do the right thing, which my son certainly did when I dragged him to a hospital, But it's that's part of as a parent, struggling to accept that you cannot save someone, and that is extremely difficult to do.
I just want to quickly respond to that. I think it's very possible for individuals to be effectively treated without having to embrace the title of the disorder that they're being diagnosed with. And I think this is quite controversial, but especially for young people who may not be fully able to embrace the whole category, it does make sense that symptoms can be addressed without having to encapsulate it in the whole concept of this is now a bipolar disorder. And I think this is sometimes a controversial piece, even in the substance abuse category, is before you can really get help, you have to admit that you have fully the problem. It's not necessarily true for certain individuals if they can admit in part to symptoms and issues that may be going on.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on that as a comment. I really like that point that you make because, I have a number of people that are, in my clinic that they have, and anyone with bipolar disorder, they have a mood or they have a name for their moods. And some people will say something like, oh, I'm in my buzzy mood, or I'm in my funky mood, or am I that? And so they, and then you want to, and in part of the historical, collection of data is to determine how many moods the individual has. And so then you say, okay, when you get into your funky mood or whatever mood it is, how do you manage that, and what strategies can we work towards managing it? So it's adapting what the individual calls it themselves, and sort of taking that forward and say, okay, when you get in your buzzy mood, then, call me or this is the strategy, or talk to your family member about it. But I really like that point about, it doesn't have to be called bipolar disorder. We just want you to stay more or less, in the zone that you want to be in, or that's healthy zone. And so if we can achieve that, we're good. There was a series of questions that I found very intriguing about families and how you deal with scenarios where, some person in the family at a holiday doesn't want to have somebody because they have this illness or they have, how do you motivate people? It goes back to that. And then questions, for families to say, well, how do I manage it? Somebody's calling me names, and so what do I do? I mean, do I support them financially? I don't want to see them, destitute on the street. Do we send them money? Do I do this, or do I, fill the gas tank as you did, Pete? How to, I just want to kind of just a brief discussion on how we kind of work with families. So Maria, I've left you alone for a little bit here. I just want to kind of ask you to start that discussion. Thank you.
I think that mental illness, and specifically bipolar disorder that we're talking about tonight, it affects the whole family, not only the individual, but the entire family. And so the individual may be suffering with certain signs and symptoms, and then the family members are suffering because they're confused, or they don't know what to do. They don't understand the illness. So I think that education, again, for family members about bipolar disorder, what it is, what to look for, what it isn't, is really important. And then there's a lot of groups for family members as well as patients. NAMI, National Alliance Mentally Ill. There's a lot of family programs and teachings, education there. Our clinic has a family and education program. So connecting family members to those types of resources are really important, and they're probably going to meet other people who are going through the same thing, and they'll get support from each other as well.
Yeah, so Pete, this is your...
So, NAMI, I'm a member of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, joined you right after I did my book. They have a family-to-family course that's free that can kind of help you with that kind of thing. But I think it's important for people to realize, you've just talked about how bipolar is fluid, and people react different ways according to that. So do families. And they react to the way that they think will help that child the most. I've done just about everything wrong in stumbling through this. But you use the tools that are available to you at the time that the person needs that tool the most. After I did my book, I spent 3 months on the streets with homeless people. And, there's a person who was totally psychotic, homeless, under a bridge, completely unaware. Would I force medicate that person? Damn right I would. And that's very controversial. Another person I dealt with was fine until he talked to you about the Mazers. What would I do? I'd get him into housing and try to work with him, try to partnership with him, try to help him along, see what he has. And third person I was dealing with had bipolar and lost his wife, family, house, everything, because he went to Atlantic City and was constantly gambling it all away. Am I going to use the same tool? Am I going to force medicate all three of them? No. So you have to target what that person's needs are at that time while trying to take care of yourself in the process. I come from a family perspective. I'll wrap this up. Guy in my book said, my sister has had schizophrenia for 30 years. She's had 15 psychiatrists. She's had more than 30 social workers. But at the end of the day, who's there? Who's there to take care of her? And I think the one fault I see in a lot of families is trying to understand the complexity of the illness. One last story. A guy who was living in a cardboard box in Miami, I worked with Judge Leichman. We got him out. We got him in housing. And I went to see him. I was so proud of myself. He's getting medication. He was doing great. And he looked at me and he said, God used to talk to me. When I was in that box, God talked to me. Now I'm a nobody. So, it's like, whoa. I don't know what the point of that was, but I wanted to share it with you.
Thank you. Thank you. So there are a number of questions about the idea and the comment that you made, Pete, about the stone catchers, and I think that is it's a very brilliant analogy, and I really, really like that. And so the question that came up to for all of the members of the panel is, how do we encourage, how do we generate, how do we create more stone catchers in the system? And so I just want to start with you, Wendy, just to give your perspective as to, because I thought that was just so enlightening and just such a brilliant observation. We need more people energized, both in the prisons, in the healthcare system, in the society, on State Street here with the individuals that you saw. How can we maximize that?
Well, it's interesting because I think that having a personal connection to it makes people more wanting to do something. So the more the word gets out, the more destigmatizing and the more open people can be about their experiences, the more personal connection you can get. I feel like that's probably one way to, I'm very fortunate. I have a great support system. I know a lot of people who aren't as fortunate, but I think that education and being more open is really key.
Thank you.
I really liked your analogy as well. And I think that having families involved, having friends involved, having other healthcare practitioners involved, psychiatrists, everyone is kind of a piece of the puzzle, and everyone can kind of, I guess, catch a different size stone, or it's a different velocity of the stone. I'm not sure. I'm trying. And but we each play a role, a really important role. And again, we just need to work together and communicate and listen to the patients and the families, because as Pete mentioned, they're the ones who are living it, going through it. I see someone for, a half an hour once a month, but the people that are living with it every day really understand what it means to have bipolar disorder.
So I concur with the others in terms of just exposing individuals who are not aware of what the illness is, bringing clarity, inviting a much more communal involvement of all to understanding, requires speaking the language, understanding the varied perspectives, and trying one's level best to be inclusive as possible with all who may be dealing with the issue.
I just love that analogy of the stone catchers, and I would say a few things. Number one, lectures like this, getting the word out, are incredibly important, getting people to be more aware of what the issues are. I would say, working a lot in the policy space, storytelling is very impactful. And so your book is so powerful because it tells a story. We recently wrote a policy paper for the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors where we created a fictional story of an individual with schizophrenia because we wanted to make some policy points, but without the story, it can be lost. So storytelling is incredibly important. The other thing I would say, and I do a lot of work with education of professionals and trying to inspire a workforce. And one of the things we really need to think about is not just trying to address the stigma of mental illness, but to address also the stigma of justice involvement and incarceration. When you hear stories like your son's about why he was justice involved, that is not the Hannibal Lecter story. Of course, nobody wants the streets to be less safe, but we also need to be smart about how we think about safety. And so really decreasing stigma of justice involvement, I think, is a really other very challenging thing, and we have to do that within our health professional workforce. Many people are arrested out of treatment settings, and that's something that I think we really need to tackle. It's not just people being arrested on the streets, they're literally arrested out of emergency rooms, out of psychiatric units, and so we need to address that as well. So stigma, stigma, attention, education, and awareness are things that I would say to get more stone catchers out there.
So I'm going to barge in here just briefly because I'm a political animal. If your local representatives gets 1 or 2 calls, that they make a note. If they get 10 calls, they pay attention. If they get 15, they get alarmed. I mean, literally, that's all it takes. And what you need to do is you need to find someone in your legislature or someone who has dealings with mental illness. This is how Parity came about. It was family members who had that. The top 5 priorities in Virginia, where I live, of the behavioral health budget have nothing to do with mental health. They're all about intellectual disabilities. Why? Because children with Down syndromes are very empathetic, and the parents fight like hell. They are constantly, from the day that kid's born, they're hammering on those doors saying, you're going to treat our child better. And we need to have that same kind of, we shouldn't be ashamed that anybody has mental illness. And we need to have that same kind of force demanding politicians pay attention.
Pete, you've inspired us. Thank you so much. And thank you to the panel for just such a wonderful discussion and an engaging debate. So I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I want to just invite you to enjoy the reception that we're hosting in the atrium, and there'll be a book signing with Pete. We have a number of different organizations and vendors that are there with tables, and please get to know them. I want to extend a special thanks to Kat Bergman, our research our marketing manager, and our research manager, Holly Bertram, and our development manager, Lisa Fabian, and the entire Bipolar research team for making this happen. Our success depends on our research participants, our participant collaborators. We have thousands of participants that are engaged with us. We have several collaborating institutions and researchers around the world. And I'm, as I invite you to enjoy the reception in the hallway, I'm going to invite the panel to go and to come up into the reception. We're going to take a group photo on that, and so Pete and others of the panel will be available for discussion in the atrium area after we have our group photo taken. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's been a wonderful evening.
Let me take that.